aspens had surrendered their gold. Now they stood like an army of pale skeletons against the bruised purple of the approaching dusk. Winter in the Colorado Rockies didn't arrive. It laid siege. It sent scouts of frigid wind down the ravines and followed with skirmishes of early snow that dusted the high peaks in a fine, menacing powder. For Samuel Creek, this was the only calendar that mattered. The turning of the leaves, the angle of the sun, the deepening quiet of the forest. These were the markers of his life, a life measured not in days or months, but in the relentless cycle of survival. His cabin, nestled in a small meadow carved out of the dense pine and fir, was a fortress built against both the elements and the world of men. It was hewn from logs he had felled and shaped himself. The chinking, a mixture of mud and moss, he'd renewed every autumn. A thin curl of smoke, gray against the graying sky, was the only sign of human life for 50 miles in any direction. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, curing venison, and a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. Samuel was a man carved from the same rugged material as the mountains he called home. He was tall, but a life of hard labor had stooped his shoulders slightly, as if he were perpetually carrying a heavy load. His beard, thick and shot through with gray, hid a jaw set in a permanent line of grim resolution. But it was his eyes that told the truest story. They were the color of a winter sky, pale blue and distant, and they held the flat, emotionless look of a man who had seen too much and had decided, long ago, to stop looking for anything more. His days were governed by a rhythm of relentless, repetitive tasks. He rose before the sun, his first chore to stoke the embers in the stone fireplace back to life. Then came the animals. His horse, a sturdy Mustang mix named Cinder, would nicker softly from the lean-to that served as a stable. Samuel would check his hooves, brush down his coat, and measure out his oats with a careful hand. There were the chickens, too, a small, hardy flock that provided precious eggs. He moved with an economy of motion, each action honed by years of practice. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. His life was a set of instructions he followed without thought, because thinking was a dangerous country he had no desire to visit. After tending to the livestock, he would take his rifle from the pegs above the mantelpiece and walk his trap lines. He moved through the woods with a ghost's tread, his eyes scanning the forest floor for sign, his ears tuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. He was a part of this world, as much as the hawk that circled overhead or the elk that bugled in the distant valleys. But he was not at peace with it. He was merely coexisting. The forest was not a sanctuary. It was a provider and a constant adversary. It gave him meat for his table and furs to trade. But it was also waiting, with the patience of stone, for a moment of weakness, a slip on an icy rock, a poorly aimed shot. He had learned its lessons the hard way. He had learned that life was fragile, that love was a warmth that only made the eventual cold more bitter. He had known that warmth once. Her name was Sarah. Her memory was not a gentle ghost. It was an ache in his bones, a permanent hollowness in the center of his chest. He could still see her, plain as day, standing in the doorway of this very cabin, her auburn hair catching the light, her belly swollen with their child. She had brought laughter into this silent place. Her voice, humming a tune as she kneaded dough, had been the only music he'd ever needed. She had planted a small garden of wildflowers by the porch, a stubborn patch of color against the vast, untamed green and gray. And then there was Lily, his daughter, a wisp of a girl with her mother's hair and his own serious blue eyes. He remembered the impossible smallness of her hand clutching his finger, the sound of her squeals as he tossed her into the air. For 5 years, this cabin had not been a fortress but a home. It had been filled with the scent of baking bread, the clutter of a child's wooden toys, and the quiet, certain rhythm of a shared life. The fever had come with the spring thaw, a cruel thief that rode in on the warm air. It had taken Lily first. her small body consumed by a fire he was helpless to quench. Sarah had followed 2 weeks later, her last breath a whispered Samuel that had shattered what was left of his world. He had buried them himself, on the rise behind the cabin, beneath the shade of a solitary ponderosa pine. He had carved their names into 2 simple wooden crosses. Sarah Creek, Lily Creek, beloved. That was 10 years ago. The wildflowers had long since been reclaimed by the wilderness. The wooden toys were gone, burned in the fire for warmth one particularly brutal winter when his grief was too raw to allow any reminders. All that remained of them was a small, locked chest at the foot of his bed. Inside was Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band he could no longer bring himself to look at, and a single faded ribbon that had once been tied in Lily's hair. He had survived. That's what people in the town of Prosperity would say on the rare occasions he rode in for supplies. That Samuel Creek, he's a survivor. They saw the hardness in him and called it strength. They didn't see the truth that the man they knew had died with his family. The thing that walked in his skin was just an echo, a machine built for the sole purpose of drawing the next breath. He had walled off his heart with stones of grief and cemented it with a vow he would never, ever, let anyone close enough to hurt him again. Love was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor, and he would have no more of it. But survival was a demanding master. As the years wore on, the routines became harder, the winters seemed longer, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. This year, something felt different. A weariness had settled upon him that had nothing to do with the hard labor. He found himself making mistakes. He'd forgotten to latch the chicken coop one night, losing a hen to a fox. He'd misjudged a shot on a fine buck, a novice's error. The solitude, once a protective blanket, was beginning to feel like a shroud. The thought came to him one evening as he sat before the fire, eating a miserable stew of dried meat and withered potatoes he'd boiled together. His cooking was functional, nothing more. It was fuel. But as he chewed the tough, flavorless jerky, a memory surfaced unbidden, the taste of Sarah's venison stew, rich with wild onions and herbs she'd gathered from the meadow. The memory was so vivid, so painful, that he set his bowl down, his appetite gone. He was tired of the silence, tired of the loneliness that he refused to name, and tired, most of all, of tasteless stew. The work of maintaining a life in these mountains was a 2-person job. He needed to spend the dwindling days of good weather hunting, chopping wood, securing his home against the blizzards to come. He couldn't afford to waste hours on chores that could be done by another. He needed help. The admission felt like a betrayal of his vow, a crack in the fortress wall. He fought it for days. He was Samuel Creek. He needed no one. But the logic of the situation was as stark and unforgiving as the landscape. If he wanted to make it through this winter without working himself into the grave, he needed another pair of hands. Not for company, not for conversation, strictly for work. A cook, someone to manage the hearth, prepare the meals, preserve the meat he brought in. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. He could frame it in his mind as a business transaction. He would provide room and board in exchange for labor. There would be no sentiment, no connection. He would make the rules clear from the outset. The decision made, he acted on it with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything else. The next morning, he saddled Cinder and made the long ride to Prosperity. The town was a jumble of raw timber buildings huddled along a muddy main street, a noisy, chaotic intrusion on the vast silence of the mountains. He hated it, the press of people, the smells of cheap whiskey and coal smoke, the meaningless chatter. It all set his teeth on edge. He tethered Cinder in front of the general store and went inside. The place was a clutter of barrels, sacks of flour, and shelves groaning with canned goods, hardware, and bolts of cloth. He bought what he needed: salt, coffee, flour, ammunition, paying the clerk with a few well-worn coins and a grunt. His final stop was the small office of the Prosperity Gazette *, a weekly paper that served the scattered ranches and mining camps in the region. The editor, a small man with an ink-stained apron and wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up as Samuel entered. "Mr. Creek, it's been a while." Samuel ignored the pleasantry. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He had spent the previous evening composing the advertisement, whittling the words down until they were as spare and functional as a well-made axe handle. "I need to post an advertisement," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He slid the paper across the counter. The editor picked it up and read it aloud, his voice inflectionless. "Cook wanted, for winter season, mountain cabin, room and board provided in exchange for labor. Must be hardworking and self-sufficient. No nonsense. Inquire by mail. Says to Creek. General delivery. Prosperity." The editor raised an eyebrow. "Short and to the point." "That's all that needs saying," Samuel replied. "It'll run you 2 bits. Samuel placed the coins on the counter. He felt a strange unease, a sense of having set something in motion that he could not control. It was the first time in 10 years he had willingly invited another person into his world. He told himself it was just business, a simple arrangement. He was the employer, and whoever answered would be the employee. A clear line would be drawn. "It will be in this Friday's edition," the editor said, scribbling a note. Samuel nodded once, turned, and walked out without another word. The ride back to his cabin felt different. The familiar landscape seemed watchful, as if the mountains themselves knew he had broken a long-held pact. As he ascended into the high country, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the sighing of the wind in the pines. The silence he returned to was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unsettling quality expectation. Back in his cabin, as the fire crackled and the shadows deepened, he stared into the flames. He had posted for a cook. He had sought a simple solution to a winter's problem. Nothing more. It was just a job. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra against the flicker of a feeling he refused to acknowledge, a feeling that was dangerously close to a long-forgotten thing called hope. He had opened the door a crack, just a sliver, and now he could only wait to see what or who would step through. 2 weeks crawled by, each day a mirror of the last. The sun rose. Samuel worked. The sun set. He chopped wood until his hands were raw, stacking the cords against the cabin wall until they formed a bulwark against the coming cold. He hunted with a renewed intensity, bringing down a bull elk and spending 3 full days butchering the meat, smoking it, and rendering the fat. He worked himself to the point of exhaustion, hoping the physical ache would drive out the gnawing anticipation in his gut. But it was no use. Every time he rode the perimeter of his land, his gaze would invariably drift down the trail that led toward prosperity. He told himself he was a fool. What did it matter who answered the ad? Or if anyone answered at all? It was a simple matter of labor. Yet he found himself cleaning his rifle with unusual care, mending a tear in his oilskin coat he'd ignored for months, even sweeping the dirt floor of the cabin with a thoroughness that was entirely out of character. He was preparing, and the act of preparation felt like a concession, a chink in the armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. Finally, he could wait no longer. He gave himself the excuse of needing more salt for the elk meat and saddled Cinder for the ride to town. The air was sharp, carrying the clean, pine-scented promise of snow. He rode hard, the rhythmic beat of Cinder's hooves a counterpoint to the anxious thrumming in his own chest. In prosperity, he hitched Cinder and went directly to the post office, which was little more than a corner of the general store sectioned off with a wooden grill. The postmaster, a balding man named Elias, peered at him over his spectacles. "Samuel, don't see you but twice a year," Elias commented, sorting through a small stack of letters. "Anything for Creek?" Samuel's voice was flat, betraying none of his inner turmoil. Elias squinted, thumbing through the envelopes. "As a matter of fact, Came in on the stage yesterday. He pulled one out and slid it under the grill. Just the one. Samuel took it. The envelope was clean, the handwriting on it neat and precise. The return address was simply a boarding house in Denver. His name, S. Creek, was written in a confident hand. He turned it over. The wax seal was unbroken. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, the stiff paper a strange, foreign object against his ribs. "That all for you today?" Elias asked. Samuel bought his salt without another word and left. He did not open the letter in town. He didn't want the prying eyes of prosperity to witness this private transaction. He waited until he was deep in the familiar silence of the high country, with only the ancient pines as witnesses. He reined Cinder to a stop in a small clearing, the late afternoon sun slanting through the trees in golden shafts. His fingers, thick and calloused, felt clumsy as he broke the seal. The letter inside was a single sheet, the message as spare as his own advertisement. Asterisk Mr. Creek. Asterisk. In response to your advertisement in the Prosperity Gazette, I wish to offer my services. I am a capable and experienced cook, proficient in managing a household under rustic conditions. I am hardworking and will cause no trouble. Asterisk. I can arrange travel to Prosperity to arrive on the 15th day of October. I trust this date is suitable. I will require directions or a meeting point to find your cabin. Asterisk sincerely. Asterisk asterisk M. Walsh asterisk. Samuel read it 3 times. M. Walsh, Michael, perhaps, or Martin. A man's name. The handwriting was neat, but that meant little. He'd known prospectors who wrote a finer script than a schoolmarm. The tone was professional, direct, proficient in managing a household. Good. That meant he understood the scope of the work. Will cause no trouble. Even better. That was the most important part. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. It was settled. A man was coming. A worker. They would keep to themselves, do their respective jobs, and at the end of winter, they would part ways. It was perfect. He folded the letter and rode home, a plan already forming in his mind. The 15th of October. That gave him a little over a week. He would write back, a short note left with Elias, telling M. Walsh to ask for directions at the general store. The people there could point him to the right trail. When he got back to the cabin, he saw it through new eyes, his eyes, the eyes of M. Walsh. The single room was dominated by his cot in one corner and the stone fireplace in the other. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. His gear traps, rifles, saddlebags hung from pegs on the walls. It was a man's space, functional and stark. It was not a space for 2 men who were strangers to one another. An employer and an employee needed their own domains. The next morning, he began to work. Just behind the main cabin, there was a small, covered area he used for storing firewood. He decided to enclose it. He spent the next few days felling several young pines, stripping their bark, and notching the logs. It was back-breaking work, but he welcomed it as he hoisted the logs into place, creating a small, windowless room not much bigger than a closet. He felt a strange sense of purpose. He was building a wall, a physical separation to reinforce the emotional one he intended to maintain. He built a simple cot inside it and ran a length of stovepipe from a small, pot-bellied stove he had salvaged years ago. It would be warm enough, private. He felt a ridiculous pride in his work, followed immediately by a surge of self-loathing. He was acting like a nervous innkeeper preparing for a guest, not a man hiring a hand. He was Samuel Creek, who needed nothing and no one. Yet here he was, building a room for a stranger. As the 15th of October drew near, the weather began to turn. The sky took on the hard, gray sheen of polished pewter. The wind, which had been a whisper, rose to a mournful howl that whipped through the pines. Samuel checked his preparations. The cabin was stocked. The woodshed was full. The animals were secure in their lean-to. All that was left was to wait. On the morning of the 15th, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, picturesque flakes of a Christmas card. They were small and hard, driven by the wind like pellets of ice. By midday, the world outside his window was a swirling vortex of white. The trail to prosperity would be treacherous, if not impassable. Samuel stood by the window, watching the storm, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Walsh wouldn't come. No sane person would travel in this. The deal was off. He felt a sharp, surprising pang of disappointment, which he quickly smothered with anger. It was for the best. He was better off alone. He had always been better off alone. He tried to lose himself in his work, oiling his traps, sharpening his knives. But his ears were tuned to the storm, listening for a sound that was not the wind. By late afternoon, the light was failing. The snow was piling up in deep drifts against the cabin walls. He had given up hope. He stoked the fire, resigning himself to another solitary meal, another silent evening. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, almost lost in the gale, a shout. He froze, his head cocked. It came again, closer this time, a human voice. He grabbed his heavy coat and rifle, his mind racing. A traveler, lost in the storm, a trapper from another valley. He unlatched the heavy door and pulled it open. The wind tore at him, blasting him with snow and ice. He squinted into the white maelstrom. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, he saw movement, a shape, dark against the white, stumbling toward the faint light spilling from his cabin. It was a wagon, a small, canvas-topped buckboard, pulled by a single, exhausted-looking horse. A figure was climbing down from the driver's seat. Samuel raised his lantern higher, its yellow light cutting a weak path through the blizzard. The figure trudged forward, head bowed against the wind. It was smaller than he'd expected. Walsh must not be a big man. As the person drew closer, stepping into the circle of light, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a man. It was a woman. Her face was pale and drawn with cold, framed by a dark wool scarf encrusted with ice. Her coat, though thick, could not hide the unmistakable swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant, and clinging to her skirts, half hidden behind her, was a small boy, no older than 8, his face peeking out from a bundle of blankets, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The woman stopped a few feet from the doorway, her shoulders slumping with relief. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and weary. "Mr. Creek," she asked, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "I'm Mary Walsh. I've come about the cook position." Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, the wind and snow swirling around him, the lantern shaking in his hand. His mind struggled to reconcile the neat, businesslike letter with the impossible vision before him. He saw the woman, her exhausted but resolute face. He saw the child, shivering beside her. He saw the life she carried within her. He had prepared for a cook, a hired hand, a simple solution to a practical problem. He had built walls, both physical and emotional, to keep the world at bay. And now, the world, in all its messy, complicated, and terrifying reality, was standing on his doorstep. The carefully constructed silence of a decade shattered. He opened his mouth, but the words felt like stones in his throat. The shock gave way to a dawning, terrible understanding. His carefully laid plans, his rules, his entire solitary existence, it was all about to be blown apart like a dead leaf in the storm. He finally found his voice, the words coming out in a hoarse, disbelieving rasp that was barely audible above the wind. "I posted for a cook, but standing at my door is a pregnant woman with a son." For a long moment, the world consisted only of the howling wind and the 3 figures frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The storm raged around them, a physical manifestation of the tempest in Samuel's soul. His first instinct was a primal, territorial anger. He had been deceived. The neat, masculine signature M. Walsh was a lie, a trick to get a foot in his door. His sanctuary had been breached not by a fellow man who would understand the unspoken rules of distance and silence, but by the very things he had spent a decade banishing from his life, a woman and a child. But the mountain code was older and deeper than his grief. It was etched into the bedrock of this land. You did not turn a soul away in a blizzard. To do so was a death sentence, and Samuel Creek was a survivor, not a hangman. With a growl of frustration that was lost in the wind, he stepped back, a sharp, angry jerk of his head his only invitation. "Get in, both of you, before you freeze to the ground." Mary Walsh didn't hesitate. She murmured something to the boy, Daniel, and guided him past Samuel into the warmth of the cabin. She moved with a weariness that went bone deep, her steps heavy, but her back was straight. As she passed, Samuel caught the scent of wet wool, cold air, and something else, the faint, clean smell of soap. It was a scent so alien in his cabin that it struck him like a physical blow. He slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off the storm's roar. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the boy's quiet, shuddery breaths. Daniel's eyes, wide and the color of moss, darted around the room, taking in the rifles on the wall, the stacked pelts in the corner, and Samuel himself, who must have looked like some wild creature of the woods. "I'll see to your horse," Samuel bit out, not looking at Mary. It was an excuse to escape the suffocating confines of the room, to breathe air that wasn't suddenly charged with their presence. He pulled on his coat and plunged back into the storm. The buckboard's horse was a pitiable sight. Covered in ice, its head drooping. He unhitched it with numb fingers, his mind a turmoil of fury and confusion. A pregnant woman. What kind of person would travel in this condition into the wilderness to take a job meant for a hardened man? It made no sense. He led the horse to the lean-to, rubbing it down fiercely with a burlap sack, finding a grim satisfaction in the hard, physical work. Cinder nickered softly, shifting in his stall, and Samuel laid a hand on his warm neck. "Don't you start," he muttered to the horse. "It's just for the winter." When he returned, a transformation had begun. Mary had removed her wet coat and scarf, revealing a simple, worn dress and a cascade of dark brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. She had guided Daniel to the hearth, and the boy was holding his small, red hands out to the flames. She was standing by the table, looking at the remains of Samuel's miserable dinner, the congealed stew, the hard biscuit. "There's an elk quarter hanging in the smokehouse," he said gruffly, stamping the snow from his boots. "And a sack of potatoes in the cellar." Mary simply nodded. "Thank you." The quiet dignity in her voice irked him more than a flood of apologies would have. She wasn't begging or pleading. She was accepting instructions, as if this were exactly what she had expected. "That room there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the small addition he had built. "That's for you. I'll take my bedroll in here by the fire." He had built it for a man, a stranger. He couldn't stomach the thought of her and the boy crammed into that windowless space. He would be the one to move. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He expected an argument, or at least a protest. Instead, she just looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That was not our arrangement. You are the master of this house. We will take the small room. It is more than we had." And that was that. She did not raise her voice, but her words were stones dropped into a still pond. Before he could argue further, she had found his spare blankets and was leading Daniel to the small, cold room. He was left standing alone in the center of his cabin, feeling like an intruder. The next few days were a battle of wills waged in silence. Samuel was determined to maintain the cold, professional distance he had planned. This was a job, nothing more. He laid out the rules on the first morning, his voice hard. Your duties are to cook the meals, keep the cabin clean, and preserve whatever meat I bring in. You'll find wood stacked by the door. The well is 20 paces out. You earn your keep. Understood. Understood, Mary replied, her hands busy kneading a small lump of dough she'd found in his supplies. But the presence of a woman and a child was not something that could be governed by rules. It was a force of nature, like the changing seasons. The cabin, his fortress of solitude, began to change. The perpetual smell of smoke and oiled leather was gradually overlaid with the scent of baking bread, simmering stew, and drying herbs. The chaotic clutter of his bachelor existence was slowly, almost imperceptibly, brought to order. His tin plates were scrubbed clean, his blankets were folded, and a sense of quiet organization settled over the space. Mary was a marvel of efficiency. She worked from dawn until dusk, never complaining, never idle. She could take the toughest cuts of elk meat and, with a few wild onions and a bit of salt, turn them into a stew that was not just fuel, but a deep, savory comfort. She found a patch of late-season rose hips and brewed a tart, vitamin-rich tea. She seemed to possess an innate knowledge of how to make a home out of the barest of materials. Samuel watched her from a distance, his heart a cold, hard knot. Each small improvement she made felt like an assault. The taste of a good meal was a betrayal to the decade of flavorless survival he had forced upon himself. The sight of a neatly swept floor was a reminder of a life he had sworn off. He ate the food she prepared in silence, offering no compliments. He would retreat to his bedroll by the fire each night, the thin wall separating him from the soft sounds of Mary humming a lullaby to her son, a sound that was a ghostly, painful echo of Sarah. It was the boy, Daniel, who was the true agent of chaos. He was a small, quiet child, but his eyes missed nothing. He was endlessly curious. He would watch Samuel for hours as he cleaned his rifle or sharpened his axe. At first, Samuel ignored him completely, pretending the boy was a piece of furniture, but Daniel was persistent. "Is that a Winchester?" he asked one afternoon, his small voice startling Samuel. Samuel grunted in reply, not looking up from the rifle's action. "My PA had a Winchester," Daniel continued, undeterred. "He used it to hunt deer." The mention of his father sent a jolt through Samuel. He said nothing, working the oilcloth over the rifle's stock with fierce, repetitive motions. The boy was a walking, talking reminder of everything he had lost. A son, a family. Daniel was drawn to the things that defined Samuel's life. He would follow him to the woodshed, watching with fascination as Samuel swung his axe, splitting logs with practiced ease. One morning, as Samuel worked, Daniel picked up a small branch and tried to mimic the motion, swinging it wildly. "Boy, stop that!" Samuel's voice was a sharp crack of a whip. "You'll put your eye out." Daniel froze, the branch dropping from his hands. His lower lip trembled. Samuel felt a flash of something ugly, a grim satisfaction at having restored the silence, followed immediately by a wave of shame. The boy was just a boy. He sighed, a ragged sound in the cold air. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "If you're going to stand there gawking, at least learn something. You don't swing an axe like a madman. It's in the shoulders. Watch." He picked up the axe and, in slow, deliberate motions, showed Daniel how to position his feet, how to let the weight of the axe head do the work. Daniel watched, his expression rapt. It was the longest conversation Samuel had initiated in years, and it was about the mechanics of splitting wood. It felt safe, practical. But it was a beginning, a hairline crack in the ice. Daniel, sensing a shift, grew bolder. His questions became more frequent. He started following Samuel on his short patrols around the cabin, his small legs struggling to keep up. He wanted to know the names of the trees, the tracks in the snow, the calls of the birds. Samuel found himself answering in monosyllables, then in short sentences. The knowledge was so ingrained in him, it came out without thought, a part of him he couldn't wall off. The true test came with Cinder. The horse was Samuel's only companion, the one living creature he allowed himself any affection for. Daniel was mesmerized by the animal. He would spend hours by the lean-to, just watching Cinder munch on hay. "Can I pet him?" Daniel asked one day, his hand outstretched. "He bites," Samuel lied. Daniel snatched his hand back, his eyes wide, but the next day, he was back. "He doesn't look like he bites," Daniel said. A statement of fact. He looked sad. Samuel stopped brushing Cinder's coat and looked at the boy. "He's not sad. He's a horse." "Everyone gets sad sometimes," Daniel said with the simple wisdom of a child. The words struck Samuel with uncanny force. He finished his grooming in silence and turned to leave. "Mr. Creek," Daniel's small voice stopped him. Could I ride him just for a minute?" "No." The word was flat and final. He walked back to the cabin, his jaw tight. To share Cinder was to share a part of himself, and that was a line he would not cross. He felt the ghost of a memory lily, squealing with delight as he led her around this very meadow on the back of a gentle mare he'd owned then. The memory was sharp, painful, and he shoved it back down into the darkness where it belonged. That night, sleep would not come. The cabin was filled with the soft breathing of its two other occupants. It was no longer his silent tomb. It was alive, and that life was slowly, inexorably, prying its way into the sealed chambers of his heart. He rose from his bedroll and went to the small, locked chest at the foot of his old cot, now occupied by strangers. He opened it. The moonlight filtering through the single window was just enough to illuminate the contents. He didn't need the light. He knew what was there by heart. He reached in, his fingers brushing past the faded ribbon, and closed around the cool, smooth weight of Sarah's wedding ring. He held it in his calloused palm, a simple gold band. It represented everything: the warmth of her hand in his, the promises they had made, the home they had built, the future that had been stolen from them. It was a symbol of the love that had nearly destroyed him. He clung to this ring, to the grief it represented, because the grief was all he had left of them. It was his shield. As long as he felt the pain, he knew he was safe from ever feeling the love again. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. He closed his hand around the ring and turned. Mary was standing in the doorway of the small room, a silhouette in the faint light. "Is everything all right, Mr. Creek?" she whispered. He said nothing, just stared at her, his fist clenched around the ring. He felt a surge of irrational anger. Her presence here, in this moment, was a sacrilege. This was his private Gethsemane, and she had intruded upon it. She must have seen the look on his face, the raw pain he thought he kept so well hidden. Her expression softened. "It's a hard thing to live with ghosts," she said, her voice barely audible. Then, without another word, she retreated back into the small room, closing the door softly behind her. Samuel stood alone in the moonlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. She had seen him. Not the hard mountain man, not the employer, but the grieving man clutching a relic of his shattered past. She had seen the crack in his armor, and she had not exploited it. She had named it, and then she had granted him his privacy. He slowly uncurled his fingers and looked at the ring glinting in his palm. For the first time in 10 years, it felt like more than just a symbol of loss. It was a reminder that a heart, even one as broken as his, had once been capable of a great and terrible love. The thought was terrifying, but as he stood there in the silent, living cabin, he had to admit, if only to himself, that it was not entirely unwelcome. Life had found its way into this house of the dead, and it was demanding to be heard. The first sign of the great blizzard was not snow, but a change in the silence. The familiar whisper of the wind through the pines deepened into a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sky, which had been a clear, sharp blue, began to fill with a milky haze, and the sun became a pale, distant wafer of light before disappearing entirely. By noon, the world outside the cabin's single window had vanished, consumed by a churning, horizontal wall of white. This was no mere snowstorm. It was a siege. The wind hammered at the log walls, seeking any crack or chink. Snow piled in vast, sculpted drifts, burying the porch and climbing halfway up the door. For the first time, Samuel felt the true, profound isolation of his mountain home. The trail to prosperity didn't just become impassable. It ceased to exist, erased from the landscape. The world was reduced to the four walls of his cabin, the howling of the wind, and the two strangers who now shared his confinement. The first day was an exercise in strained silence. The cabin, which had begun to feel organized, now felt claustrophobically small. Samuel could not escape to the woods to check his traps or chop more wood. He was trapped, forced into a proximity that scraped his nerves raw. He retreated into his tasks, mending a bridle with meticulous, angry stitches. His shoulders hunched against the room. Mary, too, seemed to withdraw, her movements small and contained as she went about her work. Daniel, sensing the tension, was unusually quiet, his boundless energy confined to drawing shapes with a charcoal stick on a spare piece of wood by the fire. The sounds of their existence were inescapable. The soft pad of Mary's feet on the floorboards, the scratch of Daniel's charcoal, the rhythmic sound of her breathing as she mended one of the boys' shirts. They were constant, quiet reminders that he was no longer alone, that his fortress had been occupied. By the second evening, the storm had not lessened. It had intensified, its voice a constant, deafening roar. The small cabin was an ark adrift in a white, featureless sea. The forced inactivity and the relentless noise began to wear on them all, fraying the edges of their composure. It was in this crucible of confinement that the first real shift occurred. After a simple supper of stew and bread, eaten in the usual near silence, Daniel began to nod off by the fire. The warmth of the hearth and the exhaustion of being cooped up all day had finally defeated him. He curled into a ball on a bearskin rug, his head resting on his mother's lap. Mary stroked his hair, her fingers moving in a slow, soothing rhythm. Then she began to sing. It was not a performance. Her voice was low and soft, a simple, unadorned lullaby about a silver ship sailing on a moonbeam sea. The melody was ancient and sad, a thread of gentle sound woven into the violent tapestry of the storm. Samuel, sitting in the shadows on the other side of the hearth, went utterly still. He had been cleaning a trap, his hands busy, his mind walled off, but the sound of her singing bypassed his defenses. It was a key turning a lock deep inside him, a lock rusted shut by a decade of grief. He closed his eyes. The cabin faded away, and for a heart-stopping moment, he was back in another time. He could hear Sarah's voice, humming that very same tune, as she rocked Lily to sleep in this very room. He could feel the phantom weight of his daughter's small, warm body in his arms. The memory was so vivid, so complete, that it stole his breath. An agony of loss, sharp and piercing as a shard of ice, lanced through him. But beneath the pain was something else, an echo of warmth so profound it made him ache. This was the sound of a home, the sound of a family. He opened his eyes. Mary was still singing, her gaze fixed on her son's sleeping face. In the flickering firelight, her expression was one of fierce, unconditional love. It was the same look he had seen on Sarah's face 1,000 times. He looked at Daniel, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep, and saw the ghost of his own child. The trap slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the stone hearth. The noise was loud in the small space. Mary stopped singing, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with alarm. Daniel stirred but didn't wake.
"Sorry,"
Samuel rasped, his voice thick.
"It's all right,"
she said softly. The silence that fell between them was different now. The lullaby had changed the air in the room, leaving it charged with unspoken emotion. Samuel stared into the fire, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He felt exposed, as if she had somehow seen straight into his soul. It was Mary who broke the silence. Her voice was hesitant, as if she were testing the fragile peace. "That song, my sister used to sing it to Daniel when he was a baby." Samuel said nothing, but he didn't turn away. He kept his gaze on the flames. "Her name was Ellen," Mary continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "She was his mother." This admission hung in the air. Samuel had assumed, naturally, that Daniel was her son from a previous marriage. "Ellen passed on 2 years ago," Mary said, her hand never ceasing its gentle stroking of Daniel's hair. "A lung sickness took her. She was never strong." Samuel thought of the fever that had taken Sarah and Lily. He knew the swift, merciless nature of such illnesses. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Her husband, Daniel's father, is a man named Jeremiah Walsh." As she spoke the name, a shadow passed over her face, and her hand on Daniel's head tightened possessively. "He is a very important man in Denver, rich, powerful. He knows judges and senators. He is a man who is accustomed to getting his own way." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The only sounds were the fire and the storm. "When Ellen was gone, I stayed on to care for Daniel. I had been helping her for years. I was more a mother to him than... well, I was the only one he had left. Ellen, in her wisdom, knew her husband's nature. She left Daniel a small inheritance, not from Jeremiah's money, but from our own family. It's not a fortune, but it's enough for a boy to make a start in the world, by the terms of her will. Jeremiah can't touch it. It's held in trust for Daniel until he turns 21. She took a deep breath. "Jeremiah controls the trust, and he wants to control the boy. He doesn't love Daniel. He sees him as another one of his possessions, another entry in his ledger. He began to change. He wanted to send Daniel away to a strict boarding school back east, to make a Walsh out of him. I couldn't allow it. It would have broken the boy's spirit." Samuel finally looked at her. He saw the truth of her words in the clear, steady resolve in her eyes. This was not a flight of fancy. This was a desperate flight for freedom. "He found a way to use the law against me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He started telling people I was an unfit guardian, that I was flighty, unreliable." She glanced down at her own swollen belly, and a flush of color rose in her cheeks. "And he used my current condition as proof. He painted me as a fallen woman, incapable of raising a decent boy." "This child," she said, her hand moving to rest protectively on her stomach, "is the result of a mistake, a foolish hope for a life that wasn't meant to be. But this child is mine, and Daniel is mine in every way that matters. Jeremiah Walsh will not have him." She told him of her escape, how she had bundled Daniel up in the middle of the night, taking only what they could carry in the small buckboard, using the last of her savings to buy the horse. She had seen his advertisement in the paper in a town miles away. A mountain cabin. A winter season. No nonsense. It sounded like the edge of the world. A place so remote that even a man like Jeremiah Walsh couldn't reach them. The M. Walsh was a desperate gamble. A hope that a man seeking a worker wouldn't ask too many questions. As her story tumbled out, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for Samuel. The desperate journey, the arrival in the storm, the quiet resilience. It wasn't foolishness, it was courage. He looked at the sleeping boy, who had known so much loss in his short life. He looked at the pregnant woman, who was fighting a powerful man for the simple right to be a mother. A fierce, protective instinct, an emotion he hadn't felt in 10 years, stirred in the barren depths of his soul. It was a primal urge, the instinct of a man to defend the defenseless, to stand between the pack and the doe. This Jeremiah Walsh was a predator, and Mary and Daniel were his prey, and they had stumbled into his territory. But with that instinct came a wave of pure, cold terror. To protect them meant to care. To care meant to open himself up to the possibility of attachment. And attachment was the doorway to the agony he had lived with every single day for a decade. Losing Sarah and Lily had hollowed him out, leaving a crater in his soul. He had survived by promising himself, by vowing on their graves, that he would never feel that again. It was better to be a dead man walking than to be ripped apart a second time. He was caught in an impossible trap. His own past was at war with his present, the man he had been Sarah's husband. Lily's father was screaming at him to stand up, to be the shield they needed. But the man he had become, the solitary, grieving survivor, was clawing at him, begging him to stay detached, to remain safe in his numb fortress. Mary had fallen silent. She watched him, her face pale in the firelight. Her secret now laid bare between them. She had given him a terrible burden, the truth, and now he had to choose what to do with it. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, but Samuel no longer heard it. The only storm that mattered now was the one raging inside of him. He could tell them to leave when the snows cleared. He could send them away, back into the world where men like Jeremiah Walsh made the rules. It would be the safe thing to do, the logical thing. It would honor the vow he had made to his own grief. Or he could stay. He could stand his ground. He could make this small cabin, this fortress of his solitude, into a sanctuary for them. It would be an act of madness. It would mean inviting the world, with all its pain and complication, across his threshold. It would mean risking everything. He looked at the sleeping boy and the weary, waiting woman, and for the first time in a very long time, the dead thing inside his chest gave a faint, painful flicker. The great blizzard broke as it had arrived, with a profound and sudden shift in the world's breathing. One morning, the relentless howl of the wind simply ceased, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. Samuel opened the cabin door to a world remade. The snow lay in immense, sculptural drifts, glittering under a sky of impossible blue. Every pine branch was heavy with a thick sleeve of white. It was a landscape of stark, pristine beauty, but also one of treacherous isolation. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. The storm had been a crucible, melting away the rigid boundaries between them. Samuel's decision to protect Mary and her son was never spoken aloud, but it was understood. It showed in the way he began to speak to Daniel not as a nuisance, but as a boy who needed teaching. He showed him how to set a simple rabbit snare, how to identify the tracks of a snowshoe hare versus a fox, and how to whittle a sharp point on a stick with a knife. He spoke more to Mary, too. The conversations were still brief, focused on practical matters, the dwindling flour supply, the strength of the new-formed ice on the creek, but they were a universe away from the gruff commands and grunts of their first weeks together. He found himself watching her, admiring the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She never complained about the cold, the isolation, or the looming threat of her brother-in-law. She simply endured, her focus entirely on Daniel and the new life she carried. This quiet rhythm was shattered on a cold, clear afternoon in late November. Samuel was high on the ridge behind the cabin, checking a trap line. When he saw them, 3 riders, dark figures moving slowly against the vast expanse of snow in the valley below. They were not hunters or trappers. They moved with the determined, purposeful air of men following a map. His gut tightened into a cold, hard knot. They were coming for him. He ran back to the cabin, his snowshoes sinking deep with each stride. He burst through the door, his breath coming in white plumes. "Mary, trouble's coming." She looked up from the table where she was helping Daniel with his letters. her face instantly pale. She didn't need to ask. She knew. "Take the boy. Go to the cellar," he commanded, pulling his Winchester from its pegs. He checked the action, his movements swift and sure. "Bar the door from the inside. Don't come out. Not for anything." Mary's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, her chin set in a defiant line. She pulled a small, leather-bound book from her satchel, her sister's diary, and clutched it to her chest. Then she took Daniel's hand and led him to the trapdoor in the floor, disappearing into the darkness below. Samuel slid a heavy chest of drawers over the door, his heart pounding a grim, steady beat. He stepped outside, his rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited on the porch. The three riders picked their way up the trail and came to a stop 20 yards from the cabin. Two were rough-looking men, their hands resting on the pistol grips at their belts. The third, clearly the leader, was dressed in a fine city coat and hat. He had a smooth, confident face that Samuel disliked on sight. "Samuel Creek," the man called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Samuel didn't answer. He just stood there, a silent, immovable part of the landscape. The man dismounted, leaving the reins of his horse trailing in the snow. He walked forward, his hand held up in a gesture of peace, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "My name is Mr. Evans. I'm an agent acting on behalf of Mr. Jeremiah Walsh of Denver. I have a court order here for the return of his ward, Daniel Walsh." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, bearing an official-looking seal. "It's all quite legal, I assure you. We just want the boy. No need for any trouble here." Samuel's eyes flickered to the paper, then back to the man's face. He knew nothing of court orders, but he knew the look of a predator. "That paper's got no authority on this mountain," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you've got no business on my land." "Now, see here," Evans said, his smile tightening. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. The law is on our side. We have been authorized to use any means necessary to retrieve the boy from the custody of an unfit guardian. The only unfit ones I see are the 3 vultures who've landed on my porch," Samuel said, his thumb moving to rest on the hammer of his rifle. A tense silence fell. The 2 hired guns shifted in their saddles, their eyes locked on Samuel. Evans's smile vanished completely. "You are making a grave mistake, Mr. Creek, a mistake that will see you in a federal prison." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. All 4 men turned. On a nearby rise, an old man with a long white beard stood beside a woodpile, an axe resting on his shoulder. It was Jebediah, Samuel's nearest neighbor, who lived 5 miles down the valley. He gave a slow, deliberate nod in Samuel's direction before turning and resuming his work. Each swing of the axe a clear statement. "You are not alone." Evans's eyes narrowed. He hadn't counted on neighbors. He had assumed Creek was a hermit. "It doesn't matter," Evans hissed, turning back to Samuel. "That boy is coming with us." Just then, the cabin door creaked open behind Samuel. Mary stood there, her face ashen, but her eyes blazing. "You will not take him." "See, Mrs. Walsh," Evans said with a sneer. "Or should I call you by your maiden name? The court has heard testimony of your moral character. It has deemed you unfit. The boy belongs with his family." "I am his family," Mary cried. Stepping forward, she held up the leather-bound diary. "My sister, Daniel's mother, knew what kind of man Jeremiah was. She wrote it all down. She knew he only ever cared about the money she left for her son." Evans laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A dead woman's diary. That's your defense that won't stand up in any court." He took a step forward. "Now, give us the boy." Samuel raised the rifle until it was pointing squarely at Evans's chest. "Take another step and you'll see how well you stand up." From the woods behind the cabin, a twig snapped. One of Evans's men spun in his saddle, his hand dropping to his pistol. "I wouldn't," a calm voice called out. Another mountain man, Silas, stepped out from behind a thick pine, his own rifle cradled in his arms. The two hired guns exchanged uneasy glances. The situation was changing. This wasn't one isolated man anymore. This was a community.
This is foolishness,
Evans shouted, his composure finally cracking.
Mister, Walsh will hear of this. He'll send the marshals.
Let him, Samuel said. We'll be waiting. As if on cue, a new rider appeared, coming up the trail at a frantic pace, but this was not another of Jeremiah's men. It was a young woman, her face flushed from the hard ride, her fine clothes splattered with mud and snow. She pulled her horse to a skidding halt and slid from the saddle. Evans stared at her, his jaw slack with shock. Miss Catherine, what are you doing here? The young woman, Catherine Walsh, ignored him. Her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were fixed on Mary. Are you Mary? She asked, her voice breathless. Mary nodded, clutching the diary. Catherine turned, her gaze sweeping over the tense scene, the armed men, the defiant woman, and the silent, immovable man at her side. Her eyes finally landed on Evans, and they hardened with a cold fire. You were sent here under false pretenses, Mr. Evans, she said, her voice ringing with authority. The court order you carry was obtained through lies and bribery. Miss Catherine, your father, Evans began, stammering. My father, she cut him off, is a fraud and a thief. His shipping business is bankrupt. He has been embezzling money for months to cover his debts. The inheritance my Aunt Ellen left for Daniel is the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. He doesn't want to protect his nephew. He wants to plunder his trust fund. The revelation struck the clearing like a bolt of lightning. The two hired guns looked at Evans, their expressions shifting from confidence to suspicion. Evans's face had gone a ghastly shade of white. That's a lie, he blustered. She's a hysterical girl. Catherine reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a sheaf of papers. Are these lies, Mr. Evans? These are copies of the ledgers from my father's own office. They show the truth of his insolvency. And this, she held up another letter, is a sworn statement from his clerk, detailing my father's plan to seize Daniel's assets by having him declared a ward of a corrupt court. She took a deep breath, her gaze finding Mary's again. I could not let him do it. Ellen loved that boy. She trusted me to look out for him. I came to warn you. The standoff was broken. The legal authority that Evans had wielded was now revealed as nothing more than a criminal's desperate gambit. His power, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled to dust. Samuel lowered his rifle, though he did not relax his guard. He looked at Evans and the two men with him, his eyes like chips of ice. You heard the lady. Your business here is done. Get off my land. And if you or anyone else ever comes back up this mountain looking for this family, you'll be carried down in a pine box. There was no arguing with the cold, final promise in his voice. Evans, defeated and exposed, scrambled back onto his horse. His two men, wanting no part of a fight they were no longer being paid to win, were already turning their mounts. Without another word, they rode away. Their retreat, a shameful spectacle against the clean, white snow. Silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of Jebediah's distant axe and the heaving breaths of Catherine's horse. The mountain men, Silas and Jebediah, slowly lowered their rifles and began to emerge, their weathered faces stern but relieved. Mary, her strength finally failing her, sagged against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face. Catherine rushed to her side, her hand resting on Mary's arm in a gesture of solidarity. Samuel stood on the porch, the Winchester still warm in his hands, and watched them. He had faced down the threat. He had protected them. The battle was won. But as he looked at Mary, pale and trembling, a sudden, sharp pain shot through her, and she gasped, her hand flying to her swollen belly. The external threat was gone. But a new and far more urgent crisis was just beginning. The retreat of Evans and his men left a vacuum in the cold mountain air. A sudden, ringing silence, where moments before there had been the threat of violence. For a heartbeat, there was only relief. Then Mary gasped. A sharp, ragged sound, and the world snapped back into focus. Her hand flew to her stomach, her knuckles white, and her face, already pale from fear, became a mask of pain. Catherine, still at her side, reacted first. "Mary, what is it?" "The baby," Mary whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "It's too soon." Samuel's blood ran cold. The victory on his porch turned to ash in his mouth. He had faced down armed men without flinching, but this was a different kind of enemy, an internal, biological force he could not reason with, intimidate, or shoot. It was the same invisible, merciless enemy that had stolen his family, the frailties of the human body. He felt a surge of the same gut-wrenching helplessness that had haunted him for 10 years. "Get her inside," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent command. The mountain men, Jebediah and Silas, who had been approaching the porch, stopped in their tracks, their weathered faces etched with concern. They understood immediately. This was a private battle, one to be fought by the hearth, not in the snow. Samuel scooped Mary into his arms. She was surprisingly light. He carried her into the cabin, Catherine rushing ahead to clear the blankets from the main cot. He laid Mary down gently, his mind a frantic, useless blank. He was a man of the wilderness. He knew how to splint a broken bone, how to stitch a wound, how to track a deer for 3 days. He knew nothing about bringing a child into the world. "Boil water," Catherine said, her voice sharp with an authority that belied her youth. She was already rolling up the sleeves of her fine dress, her city-bred panic transforming into focused action. "And find every clean piece of cloth you own." The command was a lifeline. It was a practical task, a physical anchor in a swirling sea of dread. Samuel moved to the fireplace, his movements stiff and automatic. He swung the iron kettle over the flames, then began pulling spare shirts, flour sacks, and old blankets from his chest. He didn't ask questions. He just worked. The simple, repetitive motions a barrier against the memories that were clawing at the edges of his mind, the memory of Sarah's long, arduous labor with Lily, the scent of lavender she'd kept by the bed, the memory of her sweat-soaked brow and her hand clutching his. Outside, Jebediah and Silas exchanged a look. "We'll stand watch," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, "just in case." They took up positions at the edge of the clearing, their rifles held ready. 2 silent, steadfast guardians. They were no longer guarding against Jeremiah's men, but against the intrusion of the world itself, creating a small, protected space where the fragile work of life could proceed. Inside, the cabin became a makeshift birthing room. The dying afternoon light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both intimate and immense. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the bubble and hiss of the boiling water, and Mary's ragged, rhythmic breaths. Catherine proved to be a woman of unexpected substance. She knelt by Mary's side, her face a study in concentration. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, wiping Mary's forehead with a damp cloth, her touch gentle but firm. "I helped our cook's daughter once," she explained to Samuel in a brief, whispered aside. Never taking her eyes off Mary, "I read about it in a book. It's not much, but it's something." Samuel felt a grudging respect for the young woman. She had defied her father, ridden for miles through a dangerous wilderness, and was now facing a crisis that would have sent most women screaming for a doctor. She was a Walsh, but she was cut from a different cloth than her father. Time blurred. The sun sank below the peaks, plunging the world into a deep, velvety darkness. Samuel lit every lantern and candle he owned, filling the cabin with a warm, flickering glow. He kept the fire roaring, the kettle constantly steaming. He moved back and forth, from the fire to the cot, bringing cloths, taking away used ones, his face set in a grim, unreadable mask. With every one of Mary's pained cries, a ghost of his past rose to torment him. He saw Sarah, her face contorted in a similar agony, and he felt the same uselessness, the same terror of being a mere witness to a sacred, female mystery he could not influence. His hands, capable of felling a tree or skinning a buck with a surgical precision, were clumsy and inept. "Samuel," Mary gasped during a brief respite, her eyes finding his across the room. He had been standing in the shadows, trying to make himself invisible. He was forced to step into the light. "I'm here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Don't let anything happen to Daniel," she pleaded, her voice thin. "Promise me, nothing will happen to him," he said, the words torn from his throat. It was the first promise he had made to another human being in a decade, and it felt like a brand on his soul. The hours wore on. The struggle in the cabin was a quiet, desperate war waged against time and biology. It was a fight for two lives, one weary and one that had not yet begun. Samuel felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare, forced to relive the most painful moments of his life. He remembered the birth of his daughter, Lily, the overwhelming joy of holding her for the first time, a joy so pure it had felt like a piece of the sun had fallen into his hands. And he remembered the crushing, absolute darkness when that light had been extinguished by fever. He had sworn he would never risk that pain again. And yet, here he was, in the heart of the storm, a willing participant in the very miracle that had once brought him his greatest joy and his most profound sorrow. He was helping to bring a new, fragile life into this harsh, unforgiving world. It was an act of profound, terrifying hope, and it felt like a betrayal of the grief he had nurtured for so long. "It's coming," Catherine said, her voice taut with tension. "Mary, you have to push, now!" Samuel moved to the head of the cot without thinking, his instincts taking over. He placed a hand behind Mary's shoulders, supporting her, letting her push against him. He felt the tension in her body, the raw, incredible power of it. He murmured words of encouragement, simple, meaningless phrases, "You're strong. You can do this." Words he hadn't spoken to another soul in years. They felt foreign and strange on his tongue. The final moments were a blur of focused intensity. There was a final, desperate cry from Mary, a surge of effort that seemed to draw on every last ounce of her strength. And then a new sound entered the world, a thin, wavering cry. It was the sound of a new life, fragile yet insistent, cutting through the heavy silence of the cabin. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sound Samuel had ever heard. Catherine worked quickly, her hands deft and sure. She cleaned the infant, wrapped it in the cleanest flour sack they had, and then, with a small, triumphant smile, she looked up at Samuel. "Yea, you have a new resident, Mr. Creek," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A healthy, if very small, baby girl." She held the bundled infant out to him. Samuel recoiled as if he'd been struck. "No," he said, shaking his head, taking a step back. He couldn't. He wouldn't. To hold that child would be to admit she was real, to acknowledge the bond that had been forged in this room, to accept the terrible risk she represented. "Samuel," Mary said, her voice weak but clear from the cot. "Please." He looked from Mary's exhausted, pleading face to Catherine's expectant one, and then to the small, squirming bundle in her arms. He was trapped. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out his large, calloused hands. Catherine placed the baby in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel the faint, fluttering beat of her heart through the thin cloth. Her tiny, wrinkled face was puckered in a grimace, her mouth open in a silent cry. She was so impossibly small, so utterly vulnerable. He looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart, the walls he had spent 10 years building, stone by painful stone, simply crumbled into dust. He saw Lily. He saw her tiny fingers clutching his. He saw her trusting blue eyes. The grief, the pain, the love, it all came rushing back in a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the pain of loss. It was the overwhelming, breathtaking reality of the life he held in his arms. He carried the baby to Mary and knelt by the cot. Mary reached out a trembling hand and touched the baby's cheek. Tears of exhaustion and joy streamed down her face. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered. She looked up at Samuel, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "She needs a name." Samuel looked down at the infant, at her tiny, perfect face. He thought of the woman who had filled this cabin with laughter and love, the woman who had given him the greatest gift of his life. And he thought of the grace that had, against all odds, found its way back to his desolate doorstep. "Her name," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain, "is Sarah Grace." He spoke the name into the quiet of the cabin, an offering to the ghosts of his past and a prayer for the future. The birth was over. The storm had passed, and in the arms of the broken mountain man, a new life and a resurrected heart took their first quiet breaths. The birth of Sarah Grace transformed the cabin from a tense fortress into a place of hushed reverence. The world outside, with its threats and legal battles, seemed to recede, held at bay by the miracle of the tiny, sleeping infant. For 2 days, an exhausted peace reigned. Catherine proved herself an invaluable nurse, tending to both Mary and the baby with a gentle competence. Samuel moved like a shadow in his own home, keeping the fire fed, the water warm, and his voice low. He watched the three of them, the recovering mother, the capable young woman, and the newborn, and felt a sense of belonging so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. On the 3rd day, the world returned. Jebediah and Silas appeared at the door, their hats in their hands, their faces etched with a quiet solemnity. They weren't alone. With them were a half-dozen other mountain folk trappers, prospectors, and homesteaders, men and women who lived by the unwritten laws of the high country. They had heard the story, passed from one isolated cabin to the next, of the stand Samuel had made for the widow and her boy. "Samuel," Jebediah said, his voice a low rumble, "we've come to hold court." It was not a court of law in the way the men in Denver would understand it. There was no robed judge, no bailiff, no jury box. The courtroom was the main room of Samuel's cabin. The witnesses were the silent, watchful mountains, and the law was the simple, unshakable code of community and conscience. They all filed in, their winter gear making the small space feel crowded and warm. They moved with a quiet respect, their eyes drawn to the sight of Mary, propped up on the cot with the sleeping infant in her arms. Daniel, who had been brought up from the cellar the day before, sat on a small stool by his mother's side, his expression a mixture of awe for his new sister and anxiety at the sight of all the strangers. Catherine Walsh, seeing the gravity of the moment, stood and faced the assembly. She held the ledgers she had brought, along with Ellen's diary, which Mary had given to her. "My name is Catherine Walsh," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Jeremiah Walsh is my father, and I have come to bear witness against him." For the next hour, she laid out the truth, with cold, precise detail. She explained her father's financial ruin, his desperate scheme to plunder Daniel's inheritance. She read passages from the clerk's letter, which detailed the bribery of a Denver judge to secure the fraudulent custody order. The mountain folk listened in stony silence, their faces grim. They were people who understood the value of a man's word and the poison of a rich man's greed. Then, Catherine opened Ellen's diary. "But the greatest crime," she said, her voice softening, was not against money, but against a mother's love. She read Ellen's own words, written in a fading, spidery script. The entries spoke of Jeremiah's coldness, his dismissal of Daniel as a distraction, his growing obsession with the Walsh family name and fortune. The final entry, written just days before Ellen's death, was a heart-wrenching plea. "I fear for my boy," Catherine read, her voice thick with emotion. "If anything should happen to me, I pray my sister Mary will raise him. She is the only one who has ever truly loved him as a mother should. Jeremiah sees him only as a legacy, a thing to be molded in his own image. Let Daniel be raised in kindness, not in wealth. Let him be raised in love, not in a cold house of ambition." When she finished, a profound silence filled the cabin. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung in the air. Jebediah, who had stood leaning against the mantelpiece, straightened up. He was not a judge, but he was an elder, a man who had seen 70 winters in these mountains, and his word carried the weight of stone. He looked at Mary, his gaze softening. "Ma'am," he said, "according to the laws of God and the conscience of this community, that boy," he nodded toward Daniel, "is yours. His mother's will is the only law we recognize here. Anyone who tries to take him from you will have to come through every man and woman on this mountain." It was a verdict, a declaration. It carried no legal weight in Denver, but here, in the high Rockies, it was an ironclad shield. One by one, the others in the room nodded their assent. A woman named Martha, a homesteader's wife, stepped forward and placed a small jar of preserved peaches on the table. "For the mother," she said simply. Silas laid a freshly skinned rabbit pelt beside it. "For the baby's warmth." They had come not just to judge, but to support. They were weaving Mary, Daniel, and the new baby into the tough, resilient fabric of their community. Samuel stood by the fireplace, watching it all, and felt a wall of loneliness he hadn't even realized was there begin to crumble. After the neighbors had departed, a new, more peaceful quiet settled over the cabin. The legal threat had been neutralized by a moral one. The future, which had been a terrifying unknown, now seemed to hold a flicker of possibility. Later that evening, as Mary rested, Samuel was teaching Daniel how to properly bank the fire for the night. He was showing him how to arrange the logs so they would smolder slowly, leaving a bed of hot coals for the morning. Daniel, who had been quiet and watchful all day, was concentrating on the task with a fierce intensity. "You're a good learner," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble of approval. Daniel looked up at him, his small face serious in the firelight. He had watched Samuel face down Evan's men. He had seen him carry his mother inside. He had heard him name his new sister after a memory that clearly caused him great pain. Yet he had done it as a gift. The boy's mind had been piecing it all together, trying to understand this quiet, powerful man who had become their protector. "Pa," the word was so soft, it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. It was not a statement, but a question, filled with all the hesitant hope a child's heart could hold. Samuel froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The piece of kindling in his hand fell into the flames. He didn't turn. He couldn't. The name echoed in the silent chambers of his heart, a sound he had thought he would never hear again. It was a word that meant trust and safety and love. It was the word his own daughter had called him. The pain of the memory was sharp, but for the first time, it was matched by a new, powerful emotion, a sense of profound, humbling honor. He slowly turned and looked at the boy. He didn't smile. He had forgotten how, but something in his expression must have softened, because Daniel's anxious look was replaced by a small, relieved smile of his own. Samuel simply reached out a large, calloused hand and rested it on the boy's shoulder, a silent answer that was more powerful than any words. In that moment, a bond was sealed, a choice was made, and the ghost of a father began to live again. The next day, while Mary and the baby slept and Daniel was outside building a lopsided snowman. Samuel went to the small lean-to that served as his forge. He fired up the bellows, the rhythmic whoosh, a familiar, comforting sound. He was not a blacksmith by trade, but like all men in the wilderness, he knew his way around a hammer and anvil. He could shoe a horse, mend a trap, and shape metal to his will. He took a rusty, discarded horseshoe nail from a bucket of scraps. It was a common, ugly thing, bent and forgotten. He heated it in the glowing coals of the forge until it glowed a cherry red. Then he began to work. With steady, deliberate blows of his hammer, he began to transform it. The clang of metal on metal rang out in the crisp winter air. He was not just shaping a piece of iron, he was hammering out his thoughts, his fears, his decision. Each blow was a strike against the loneliness of the past decade. Each turn on the anvil was a turning toward a future he had never thought possible. He was forging a promise, a circle with no beginning and no end. He worked until the nail was no longer a nail, but a simple, unadorned iron ring. It was not beautiful. It was rough, dark, and imperfect, but it was strong. It was real. That evening, he approached Mary as she sat in a chair by the fire, rocking Sarah Grace in her arms. The cabin was quiet, filled with a deep, domestic peace. He stood before her for a long moment, the iron ring hidden in his clenched fist. He didn't have the words for poetry or romance. His heart spoke a plainer, more direct language.
Mary,
He began, his voice rough. This cabin, it was a lonely place for a long time. It's not lonely anymore. He looked at the baby in her arms, then at Daniel, who was asleep on the bearskin rug. A woman needs a husband. A boy needs a father. A baby needs a name to carry. He opened his hand and held out the simple iron ring. It lay dark and solid in his palm.
I'm not a man of fancy words,
he said, his gaze meeting hers. I can't offer you wealth or an easy life. This mountain is a hard place. All I have is this cabin, my name and my strength. I'm asking if you'll share them with me. He took a deep, ragged breath. Mary Walsh, will you be my wife? Mary looked from the ring in his hand to the raw, vulnerable hope in his eyes. Tears welled, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, quiet joy. She had come to this mountain seeking only refuge, and she had found a sanctuary. She had come seeking a job, and she had found a home. She didn't need a golden ring or a pretty promise. She needed a partner, a protector, a man of substance. And he was standing before her. She slowly held out her left hand. Samuel took it, his touch surprisingly gentle. He slid the simple iron ring onto her finger. It settled into place as if it had always been meant to be there. It wasn't a replacement for the gold ring he still kept locked in the chest. That ring represented a past he would always honor. This iron ring, forged from scrap and fire and a mountain man's will, was a promise for the future. It was not about forgetting what was lost, but about having the courage to build something new. The passing of winter on Samuel's mountain was not a single event, but a slow, grudging retreat. It began with a change in the sound of the wind, a softening of its sharp, angry edge. Then came the melt. For weeks, the world was filled with the sound of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin, from the burdened branches of the pines, from the vast, shrinking snowfields. The creek, which had been frozen into a silent, solid road of ice, began to groan and crack, eventually breaking free with a roar, its dark, rushing water a testament to the life returning to the land. With the thaw came the mud, and with the mud came news. A lone rider from Prosperity, a young man named Tom who carried the mail when the trails were passable, made his way up the mountain. He brought coffee, flour, and a letter from Denver addressed to Catherine Walsh, who had stayed on, becoming an indispensable part of their small, makeshift family. They gathered around the rough-hewn table as Catherine read the letter, her face a mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction. The news was conclusive. Faced with the evidence of the ledgers and the clerk's sworn testimony, Jeremiah Walsh's empire of deceit had collapsed. He was ruined, convicted of embezzlement and fraud. His good name in Denver society turned to dust. The court, eager to distance itself from a disgraced judge, had formally and permanently recognized Mary as Daniel's sole legal guardian. The threat was over. The ghost that had haunted them was finally laid to rest. The letter also mentioned that Jeremiah's grand house was to be sold, and with her portion of the remaining family assets. Catherine planned to stay in the West and fulfill a long-held dream to use the money to build a proper schoolhouse in prosperity. A heavy silence fell over the cabin when she finished reading. It was not a victory to be celebrated, but a tragedy to be acknowledged. Mary wept quietly, not for Jeremiah, but for the final, bitter end to a chapter of her life. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a simple, solid gesture of support. As the last of the snow receded, revealing the damp, sleeping earth, the mountain began to awaken. The first green shoots of columbine and Indian paintbrush pushed their way through the pine needles. The aspens began to bud, their pale bark looking soft and new. The air grew thick with the scent of pine sap and rich soil. It was a season of new beginnings, and it was time for theirs to be formalized. The wedding was as simple and sturdy as the iron ring on Mary's finger. The circuit preacher, a lean, weathered man named Reverend Miller who rode a mule named Patience, made his way up to the cabin on his spring route. Their entire community attended. Jebediah and Silas arrived, their faces scrubbed clean, their beards neatly combed. Martha, the homesteader's wife, came with her husband and 2 shy children, bringing a freshly baked apple pie. The handful of other mountain folk who had stood with them arrived one by one, their presence a quiet testament to the bonds forged in the face of a common threat. They stood outside on the porch, under the vast, clear sky, with the mountains as their cathedral. Mary wore a simple dress of blue calico that Martha had helped her sew, a few early wildflowers tucked into her hair. In her arms, she held Sarah Grace, who was swaddled in the soft rabbit pelt blanket. Daniel stood beside Samuel, his hand tucked firmly in the big man's grasp, his chest puffed out with a seriousness that befitted his role. Samuel wore his cleanest buckskin shirt. He felt awkward and exposed, unused to being the center of attention. But when he looked at Mary, at the quiet strength and gentle love in her eyes, the rest of the world faded away. Reverend Miller's words were not flowery. He spoke of partnership, of shelter in a storm, of the courage it takes to build a home in a hard land. He spoke of family not as a thing of blood, but as a thing of choice and commitment. When it came time for the vows, Samuel's voice was a low, steady rumble. "I will," he said, his eyes locked on Mary's. It was not just a promise to her, but a promise to himself. A promise to be present, to be a husband, to be a father, a promise to live again. Mary's "I will" was a soft, clear echo of his own, a promise of partnership, of comfort, of a shared future. And then it was done. There was no grand celebration, just a shared meal of roasted venison and Martha's apple pie. The neighbors offered their quiet congratulations and, one by one, made their way back to their own homesteads, leaving the newly formed family alone in the peaceful twilight. In the months that followed, the cabin was transformed. It was no longer a place of mere survival, but a place of life. The silence was filled with new sounds, the happy gurgle of a baby discovering her own voice, the laughter of a boy learning to ride, the quiet murmur of a husband and wife talking by the fire after a long day's work. Mary, with Daniel as her enthusiastic assistant, planted a garden. It was in the same spot where Sarah's wildflowers had once grown. She planted potatoes and beans and squash, practical things for a growing family. But around the edges, she planted seeds that Catherine had brought up from town, columbine and larkspur and wild blue flax. She was not erasing the past, she was tending to its memory, coaxing new life from the same soil. Samuel taught Daniel to ride Cinder. He started by leading the horse in slow circles around the meadow, just as he had done with Lily. The memory was still there, a bittersweet ache, but it was no longer a ghost that paralyzed him. It was a gentle shadow that walked alongside him, a reminder of the love that had shaped him. Soon, Daniel was riding on his own, his small body a natural fit in the saddle, his face alight with a joy so pure it made Samuel's heart swell. The boy's use of pa was no longer a hesitant question, but a simple, easy fact. Samuel built a new room onto the cabin, a proper bedroom for him and Mary, with a real window that looked out onto the meadow. He built a cradle for Sarah Grace, carving the headboard with the rough shape of a soaring hawk. He spent hours just watching the baby, marveling at her tiny, perfect fingers, at the way she would grasp his calloused thumb in her sleep. He saw Lily in the shape of her eyes, but he saw a new and unique person in her fierce, determined little frown. He was not replacing his lost daughter. He was making room in his heart for a new one. One evening, as the summer sun bled a fiery orange and soft purple across the peaks, Samuel sat on the porch steps, watching his new life unfold before him. The air was cool and smelled of pine. Mary was humming a lullaby as she rocked Sarah Grace by the open doorway. In the meadow, Daniel was trying to teach a new colt, a gift from Jebediah, to accept a halter, his voice a patient, serious imitation of Samuel's own. The cabin glowed with the warm light of the lanterns inside. It was no longer a fortress against the world. It was a beacon. He thought of the man he had been just one winter ago, a hollow shell, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. He had been so certain that his life was over, that his heart was a barren, frozen landscape. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the familiar, smooth weight of Sarah's gold ring. He still carried it. He always would. It was a part of him, a testament to a love that had been real and true. But it was no longer a shield of grief. It was a foundation stone, the bedrock upon which this new, unexpected life had been built. He had learned that a heart, even one shattered into 1,000 pieces, could be remade. It would never be the same, but it could be whole again, its cracks filled with the gold of new memories, new loves. He looked at his wife, his son, his new daughter. He looked at the home they had built together, a small, stubborn point of light and warmth against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A quiet, profound gratitude washed over him, a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He thought back to the advertisement he had placed, the desperate, practical act of a man who just wanted someone to cook his meals. He had asked for so little, and he had been given everything. His voice was a low whisper, spoken only to the mountains and the ghosts who walked among them. I posted for a cook, but I received a pregnant woman with a son, who taught me how to love again. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider giving it a boost by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world